Previously on STSP.
Are we rolling? We're live? Okay. Hello, friends. This is Canadian actor William Tiberius, Shatner, superstar of stage and screen. It is my pleasure to welcome you shitposters to this special world premiere event, the dramatic reading of Star Trek Severed Ties, Unbroken Chains, an original fan fiction submitted by Gromp member Casey Gertz and read aloud. Exactly, and I do mean exactly as written by your Star Trek shitposting modmans. Unrelated, I once shit my pants on Broadway. Google it, it's true. Okay, now sit back and enjoy the show. Don't forget to tip your modmans on the way out. And in the immortal words of my friend and co-star Leonard Nimoy, live fast and get fucked, or whatever. Scotty, are we clear? Is the camera off?
Aye, sir.
Wait. Don't beam me up yet, Scotty. I'm taking a shit.
Chapter 1. The Defection of Commander Sharvanik.
Captain's Log, Stardate 7417.6, late October 2279 by the Earth calendar. Starship USS Thor's Hammer, of the newly commissioned Arbe class Photon Torpedo Destroyer Line. Captain Richard McAllister commanding. We in the other PDT, with which it has become standard operational regulation that we be paired with when out on regular border patrol, have now completed the first 3 Earth weeks of our newly assigned duty area along our side of the RNZ. Thus far, no known violations of Federation territory by any Romulan vessels or any other activity in this or adjacent sectors have been observed. But, as it turns out, and as per the top-secret orders issued to myself and my command officers by Admiral Mancuso of Carrier Group 12 under the 9th Fleet Division, we are told to expect pre-arranged arrival of a pair of older generation Romulan battlecruisers any given day now, at any possible moment. As I and my entire roster of command officers were prior informed before leaving Space Dock 1 over Earth to come all the way out here, this unprecedented occurrence is expected due to an equally unprecedented clandestine message that had apparently been sent all the way to Starfleet Command by what effectively amounts to being the ringleader of a large group of Romulan defectors that had supposedly stolen the aforementioned older battlecruisers as a means of making their way to us for purposes which we expect to be made aware of upon making contact with that ringleader. And, as we were further told, the ringleader in question is said to have had more than one encounter with the Starship Enterprise, both in the 2260s and again in mid-2270. Her name is Charvanek, and in her message she had vehemently emphasised that it was in fact of the most dire importance that what she offered on behalf of both herself and those who are expected to be with her be taken seriously. Her message apparently went on to state that in return for our agreement to trust her and her 2 battlecruisers worth of Romulan defectors, She'll come here with the secondary intention to simply hand over both vessels, in addition to whatever it is that constitutes the subject of her supposed offer. Beyond that, the remainder of her message's content was not made known to me or my command officers back at Starfleet HQ, as it was deemed necessary to keep us in the dark on that until the twin battlecruisers finally arrive here, upon which time Charvanek will apparently fill us in on that herself. But it was, however, strongly emphasised by Admiral Mancuso that we not only take it seriously, but that whatever Charvanek is about to offer us is what the good Admiral called a 1 in a million chance worth taking. I didn't ask further, as my officers and I understand how the Cloak and Dagger game has to be played with the Romulans, in light of what little we still know about them at all in their current manifestation. The last thing we were made to understand is that it would not be known precisely when Charvanek and her fellow defectors, assuming it's not a load of bullcrap of course, would actually arrive here. And further, this is apparently because not even she could be certain when she and the others would finally get here. Only that one way or another they surely would. According to Mancuso, she had apparently made it sound in her only message to Starfleet HQ that any delay would be due to how difficult it would be for her and her fellows to safely make off with the 2 Romulan battlecruisers, even if they were only going to be just 1 generation behind what the greater Romulan fleet is using in the modern day. Apparently, a pair of slightly older battlecruisers is as good as she felt she and those who make her way here with her could safely acquire and actually get away with stealing them from the Romulan Empire's naval inventory. I guess we'll see how true it all turns out to be. In the meantime, we continue to patrol this sector along the RNZ. Specifically, a mere warp day from Nelvana 3 inside the RNZ itself. And we continue to watch the starscape for her arrival, while my communications officer continues to scrutinise the airwaves for any further communiques from Charvanek herself that she has arrived. I can't help the anxiety at the thought that something about this is either a load of crap or, at the very least, that something might go terribly wrong with this meetup, even if she herself is actually sincere in her professed intentions. Captain Richard McAllister, USS Thor's Hammer.
Indeed, there sat a calm but visibly discomforted Captain McAllister in his captain's chair of segmented, soft grey upholstery, with its silvery metallic hinged armrests rising just above and extending inward over his thighs. Despite that its professionalism-boosting maroon wool uniform blazer was as perfectly pressed as that of any other officer or enlisted midshipman on the dull, battleship grey-toned main bridge of his vessel, one could easily note the apprehension he felt deep inside. He sat there in silence after having just completed his latest captain's log entry, staring at the glitter of stars shown on the main viewer. Meanwhile, his brow was almost scornfully frowned as his eyes remained transfixed on the main view screen. Captain McAllister was a man of approximately his late 30s and was of reasonably fit build. He had lightly tanned skin, as if he has recently spent some time in an especially sunny environment prior to this particular mission, and his eyes were a hazel green. His chiseled jawline was clean-shaven, with not even a mustache to speak of. His dark brown hair was done in a military-style crew cut that slowly faded in its well-groomed taper the further it fell down the sides and back of his head, until disappearing completely at about where the back of his neck would meet the base of his head at the rear. On the left side of his chest was the usual satin-sheen bronze Starfleet Delta shield and ring logo, with the horizontal round-ended side nodules protruding out to the sides from behind the central logo itself. And below that, there hung an ornate panel of various tightly adjoined rectangular service medals and devices of a myriad of colors, further below which hung a variety of more ornate ribboned medals and the like. All in all, this was the uniform of a man who had seen his fair share of action in his previous tours of duty, and he had the proudly displayed uniform adornments to prove it. Meanwhile, other officers and crew who moved about the bridge carrying out their various duties between the surrounding consoles and the twin-seated helm did so with a shared purposeful haste that was offset only by a palpable discomfort of their own. But there was little if any actual conversation between the lot of them at the moment. One could burn through the ongoing tension with a modern Type II phaser. At the moment, the pair of Abe-class torpedo destroyers, the USS Thor's Hammer and its closely following sister ship, the USS Ares, were in a standard high-altitude orbit around a large asteroid on which one could see an elaborate metallic city of concentric metallic rings standing on the dark side of the great floating rock itself. The glisten of twinkling city lights stood out against the poorly lit side of the asteroid, its various small rising towers and modules barely discernible against the starry interstellar sky far beyond. At one side of the asteroid, and just around its bend from where the surface starbase clung to its rocky and uneven surface, there could be seen at least one very large and cavernous, rectangular, tunnel-like structure that was set deeply into the great stone mass of the asteroid. The docking bay in question looked large enough to contain at least 4 full-size Constitution-class starships if they had been present, and, seeming to hover above the asteroid itself in a barely visible movement speed, there were the matching pairs of Abe-class photon torpedo destroyers sitting in wait for the Romulan battlecruisers that may or may not arrive at any given time. The arrival at long last. Suddenly, and after weeks of waiting, Captain McAllister heard from behind and to his left what he and everyone else had long since been waiting for.
"Sir, we're being hailed. Source unknown, but on a Romulan channel,"
came a soft-spoken woman's voice that radiated an odd mix of apparent relief and a sudden jump in nervousness all at once. There at the communications console, set into the rear left quarter of the main bridge's enclosed domed interior wall, sat an Asian woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, wearing the lower mid-thigh black-skirted version of the standard maroon-red Starfleet uniform, with soft wool blue-gray ribbed collar turtleneck and rank-bearing right shoulder strap. The expression on her face was subtly visible, but did denote her apparent subdued angst as she stared and paused towards Captain McAllister. Upon hearing the communications officer's seemingly stifled voice utter those words, everyone on the bridge momentarily froze in place no matter what they were doing. During that moment of collective pause shared by all, everyone proceeded to exchange various looks of everything from nervous anticipation to impatience for answers to even a certain air of eagerness to see this ordeal through already. But then, all at once, they all seemed to simultaneously spring back into motion and resume their varied tasks.
"It's about damn time,"
McAllister mumbled to himself under his breath as his eyes darted to the left corners in reaction to the communication officer's announcement. But immediately returning his attention to the main viewer, he then quickly inquired,
"Is it her?"
After a moment spent fondling the small, thin, cylindrical Bluetooth earpiece set into her left ear while staring intently off into space, the young Asian woman glanced back towards McAllister and nodded while eagerly chirping.
"Yep. She identifies herself as Charvanik, and it does sound like her voice, sir. And she's requesting visual."
Captain McAllister's expression suddenly grew wide-eyed with confusion as he shook his head and sarcastically blurted,
"Well, of course. Put her on then."
With that, McAllister's expression suddenly became more subdued. He now stared at the main viewer intently, sitting in eager anticipation of what sort of conversation was about to take place. A single high-pitched ping was heard as the communications officer quickly replied,
"On screen."
and instantly the familiar face of a now widely known Romulan woman appeared on the main view screen. And as soon as she appeared, staring almost apologetically towards the view of Captain McAllister and crew, she wasted no time in nodding and impatiently blurting,
"I'm ever so sorry it took this long. Cloak or no, it is indeed most difficult for virtually any Romulan vessel to move about even its own territory without inevitable detection by the Praetor's transponder tracking relay network. One of my Centurions per each of our pair of ships had to physically climb into its respective avionics and communication hardware bays to rip it out. They are made difficult to access and remove on purpose, you see."
Suddenly nodding sarcastically in reaction to Charvanik's explanation, McAllister smugly barked,
"Yeah. Keeps her pawns on their leashes where they belong, I'm sure."
Momentarily pausing in his words, his expression suddenly shifted to one of apparent sympathy as he then added,
"Just meaning as far as he probably sees it, is what I'm saying."
Charvanik nodded again, this time in agreement, as she just as smugly countered,
"And you're not wrong. We even had to take the long way here by going through a number of nebulae that were especially active electromagnetically, just to hide from other vessels of the Star Empire. They are all equipped with various features for homing in on each other for that very same reason, even if the transponders have been removed."
Upon hearing her further explanation, McAllister flashed a mildly frowned expression as though a thought had just dawned upon him that it was time to get down to business. and so he firmly but calmly inquired.
You know, on the subject of detection, I've been led to understand that just to show your goodwill, you've agreed to also remove your cloaking devices and beam them over to either one of our ships for the duration of your presence here inside Federation space. Just so you couldn't trick and evade us that way if, in fact, this whole meeting is somehow bullshit.
Charvanik let a lightly entertained grin work its way onto her face as her eyes drifted down for a moment. She paused like that, seeming to stare down and off into space for just a moment, then glancing up with just her eyes despite her still dipped chin. With that, she softly answered,
It's not. And yes, we are about to disengage our cloaks for timely removal. Are your transporter rooms standing by?
Psh, McAllister hissed back with another comical nod and smug grin to match, then adding,
Yes, we've all been waiting here to get this over with for weeks now.
Charvanik gently raised her chin, and her grin turned slightly more confident. She gave but one final subtle nod, in turn adding,
We are about to become visible now. And by the way, we don't want the cloaking devices back. Ever. Part of what we came here to offer is the best sample we could of our technology for your study. In short, dear Captain, keep the cloaks once we beam them over. And in fact, I strongly encourage you to make it a point to ensure that they find their way into the capable hands of, what is it called? Your Jupiter research station in orbit around the Jovian moon you call Ganymede.
McAllister's eyes widened with pleasant surprise and disbelief, his eyebrows perking enthusiastically as he abruptly barked,
Really?
At that same moment, various bridge officers, midshipmen, and yeomen around McAllister had themselves either paused or otherwise took on similar looks of utter surprise. But none among them dare speak, as the captain was in charge after all.
I know.
Charvanik almost moaned with a deep sigh and resulting half-shrug, her face now offering a subtle plea to McAllister as she continued.
This all sounds too good to be true to you and your higher authorities, I'm sure.
Yeah, no shit.
McAllister barked with a disbelieving nod and a shrewdly frowned brow, his tongue now pressed sarcastically into his cheek. Just then, however, his face began to show his skepticism.
I'll tell you what, though.
He quickly added. Charvanik tilted her chin almost inquisitively to him in turn, awaiting what he was about to say. She herself said nothing at that moment. With that, McAllister quickly asserted,
Your further willingness to beam over here yourself so we can talk shop face to face would go a long way too. Just an idea.
Agreed.
Charvanik nodded eagerly once more, before almost impatiently adding,
But even our intention to hand over the cloaks and later these two entire battle cruisers, which is also part of what we're here to give you.
Meanwhile, at that moment, Captain McAllister himself and several bridge personnel around him frowned in utter shock and dismay upon hearing what Charvanik had just said, but none of them dare interrupt as they listened to her continue to speak.
These are boons in themselves. Yet, even all of this is secondary to what we've really come here to warn you of. And make no mistake, Captain, you do need to know now what is coming your way. And I'm not making a threat. I'm giving you a warning about something else, our disagreement with which led myself and my fellow defectors here to spend several of your Earth months debating, even deciding to do this, and ultimately agreeing that fleeing the Star Empire is unfortunate, but necessary for us.
So you're saying what? Something's gone down that's caused some internal conflict in the upper echelons back where at Romulan Central?
McAllister inquired impatiently, his face now rather crass with ever greater confusion and skepticism.
Among other things.
Charvanik moaned again, her expression only more prominently pleading to him.
So what exactly is this terrible thing we gotta worry about?
McAllister inquired more calmly.
That needs to be spoke of in person.
Charvanik countered with still present impatience.
Give us one of your half-hour periods to disconnect the cloaking devices from each of these cruisers and move them to your transporters to be sent to one of your two vessels. Then I myself will beam aboard with them. Because you're right, we do need to talk as soon as possible, and believe me, we have a lot to go over. As soon as possible.
Okay.
McAllister half-moaned suspiciously, his expression again skeptical, but now inquisitive as well.
You won't mind if I let Starfleet HQ know of this interesting development then?
He teased, as if to test her.
Not at all. In fact, make it a point to do so urgently. But do it over your most secure channels, Captain. We do not want even this much going over the regular airways. I'll explain why while I'm on your ship.
You got a deal.
McAllister grinned smugly, his suspicion still present. Just then, his rigidly extended right forefinger suddenly jumped up in front of his chest, squarely thrusting itself as Charvanik as he firmly demanded,
But do not bullshit us. You're coming out of nowhere with this miraculous offer of technology, including 2 entire ships, by the way, and we haven't even gotten to what you claim you're really here to tell us, let alone what you're probably going to ask of us in return for this.
We'll get to all that.
Charvanek nodded impatiently again.
And indeed, Captain, we will be asking something of your highest Federation authorities for what we bring you today. But again, the rest really needs to be discussed in person, and not over any subspace channels. But I promise, all will be clear as that conversation is had.
Captain McAllister again thrust his tongue into his cheek in apparent hesitation. He sighed deeply, paused, and then finally commanded,
Then hurry up and get the damn things unhooked and get the hell over here so we can get down to business.
Expect our next hail the moment the cloaks and I myself are all ready for transport.
Charvanek shot back with one final abrupt nod. And just as quickly as she had given her reply to McAllister's demand, the main viewer flashed from the visage of Charvanek herself to the deep forest green background screen featuring the green-blue-magenta bird-like logo of the Romulan Star Empire, with a single line of text immediately beneath, which translated to the effect of "End transmission." To trust or not to trust? At that moment, with the utterly deafening silence shared by all personnel on the bridge being offset only by the usual continuous electronic noises of various computer systems emitting from various consoles throughout, McAllister continued to gaze at the main view screen as if totally dumbfounded by what had just occurred. And so he held himself like that for several seconds of silent pause, until finally he shook himself back to reality with a single twitch of his head and strained blink of his then widened eyes. With that, he sarcastically huffed,
Ugh, Admiral Mercuzzo and Admiral Nagura are just gonna shit their pants when they hear what just happened.
And that's without counting what Admiral Kirk's gonna say.
The communication officer couldn't help but chuckle aloud, shaking her head playfully and now bearing a thoroughly entertained smile on her face.
Oh god, don't fucking remind me.
Captain McAllister moaned awkwardly as he turned himself in his char so as to face the communications officer where she continued to sit at her console, then dropping his forearms into the raised open palm of his right hand.
He already has dealt with this chick. Twice.
Well, to be fair, sir,
began the voice of another woman in her early 30s who had been standing off to McAllister's right the entire time, a blonde of medium build whose hair was done in a tightly bound, neat bun, high at the back of her head. She then continued with a reassuring nod.
the second time Kirk encountered Commander Charvanek, she did tell him the right access code to remotely power down her Bird of Prey's plasma ring weapon just in time to kinda save what was left of the Enterprise.
McAllister finally raised his face from his palm, glared hesitantly over to the female blonde in question, and hissed,
Well, yeah, but I don't know. All this seems too good to be true, even if we take that into account here.
Again, speaking as if attempting to reassure McAllister, the blonde woman once more countered.
If it were some random Joe Blow Rami, I'd agree. But what if that decision really changed something in her where her view of the Federation is concerned? I mean, not saying I'd buy this hook, line, and sinker, at least not till we get her over here and get talking. But, I just don't get the sense she's screwing with us at all. Not her, sir.
Yeah, but keep one thing in mind, number one.
McAllister calmly murmured in turn with a stark expression towards her.
It was well known that this Chabernack broad was also visibly observed being passionate about her loyalty to the Romulan Star Empire in both cases. So now she's just going to cut and run after all that?
McAllister then paused, glaring suspiciously at the woman he had just referred to as his number one from beneath a raised eyebrow.
I'd hardly assume it was a sudden decision, sir.
The blonde female first officer began again with a clearly open-minded attitude. And, with an equally stark expression to match McAllister's, she quickly delved further into her clearly well-considered standpoint on the matter.
First off, that was 12, almost 13 years back. It was the end of the pre-refit Enterprise's 5-year mission under Kirk's first-time command run, too. And a lot can happen in 13 years. Not counting how during that very second-time encounter with this girl, she even helped the Enterprise fight the other Federation starship those goddamn Espers stole right before the Bird of Prey unloaded a ring shot on both starships at least once before Charvanek finally did tell them how to shut that bastard down at the last moment.
McAllister, still glaring up at her from where he leaned forward and propped up on his knees by his cocked elbows and his clasped hands covering his mouth, as if in a moment of stress-inducing deep thaw, kept silent. It was, for the moment, he had no idea what to say. But his silence was only matched by that of all other personnel on the bridge, all of whom now stood motionless while gazing at McAllister himself in suspense. Finally, McAllister himself bowed his head back in his still clasped open palms, all the while emitting a deeply exasperated sigh and loudly groaning.
Alright, fine. We give the girl the benefit of the doubt. I just hope you're right about this crap.
The blonde female first officer said nothing in turn, but grinned at McAllister sympathetically. Others on the bridge, meanwhile, either did the same or continued to watch him nervously, though subtly so. But the unnerved silence shared by all was again stifling. After a moment's pause like that, McAllister raised his head again and turned in his captain's chair to once more face the main viewer. No sooner had he done so than he suddenly launched a frustrated wave of the hand out into the open air before him, at the same time erupting,
Well, let's see what happens in the next half hour.
waiting uncomfortably. Just as McAllister had made his comment, there came the sudden bark of another male voice from the single control station directly to the rear of the bridge, between the aftward twin turbolift doorways.
There they are, sir. 2 second-gen V-11 Romulan Stormbirds directly ahead. Decloaking now.
This being a surprise, despite all having been told it was about to occur, Captain McAllister gazed at the main viewer with as much hesitation visible on his face as could be seen in the rest of the bridge personnel. Giving a single subtle shake of his head and yet again poking his tongue into his cheek, McAllister nervously murmured,
And here we go.
And indeed, there slowly began to appear a matching pair of what at first looked precisely like Klingon D-7 battlecruisers, sitting stationary just a mere few thousand meters further ahead against the star-glittered blackness of space. But as the rainbow-stained watery ripple of their transparent physical profiles began to further solidify, and the rippling began to calm, their finite details steadily became all the clearer. Finally, once the decloaking process had fully completed for both battlecruisers, it was indeed a pair of Romulan vessels rather than Klingon. All could see the blue tones of the bird-like feather texturing that dominated their hulls. There the two vessels sat, side by side. They now floated and totally inanimate against the backdrop of the vast starscape behind them, except for the usual plethora of illuminated windows, as well as the aquamarine glow of the inner radiator panels of their downward-hanging nacelles, and the much greener glow of the vertically slotted concave navigational array at the front of the box-like dorsal module to the rear of the upper hull. As far as everyone on the bridge of the USS Thor's Hammer could see, the single photon torpedo tubes at the front of the Stormbird's bulbous command modules were dark and inactive. None of the tiny disruptor turrets appeared to be lit, and in fact, no apparent activity of any kind was seen in either vessel. Now, having shared another moment of silent pause with the rest of the bridge crew, the blonde female first officer shrugged nonchalantly and calmly commented,
Well, theoretically this means they're now starting to uninstall their cloaking devices.
Trying to feign an air of confidence, she simply grinned falsely as she continued to stare at the twin Romulan vessels on the view screen before her. With a distrustful raise of one eyebrow, Captain McAllister nodded and mumbled,
Yeah, theoretically.
The first officer chuckled softly to herself, but said nothing more, still watching the main viewer as intently as everyone else on the bridge. McAllister turned around in his captain's chair once more, now facing directly to the rear bridge station and locking eyes with the man who had announced the coming appearance of the two Romulan vessels. At that aftward station between the twin turbolifts, a station whose small, black, text-printed overhead wall signage read Combat Intelligence Center, there sat a Caucasian man in his mid-20s. He was of reasonably fit stature and had a similarly militaristic crew cut of auburn hair. The pupil of his eyes were a soft blue gray. Having noticed the captain turning around to address him, his attention left the main viewer and refocused towards the captain's intent glare at him. With that, he nodded gently and said,
No shield up, and none of their weapons seem to be arming at all. Sir, they're behaving. So far.
McAllister agreed, with a nod to match that of his subordinate, and a lingering skepticism on his face. Then, still turned to the face of the CIC station, he turned his head slightly to his right and let his eyes dart over to the female Asian communications officer, who had also been eyeing him intently in wait for his next orders. Her face was otherwise seemingly blank, however.
Lieutenant Ming,
He began with a soft sigh.
raise Admiral Mancuso and tell him that they're visible. And tell him I want to talk to him about the,
He paused, then showing his apparent frustration by once more rubbing his forehead with his right open palm and smirking, then continuing further as he stared off into space.
the really bizarre turn of events that just took place.
His eyes then darted back up to meet those of the communications officer he had just referred to as Lieutenant Ming. Ming herself nodded hastily, spun back around in her chair to face her respective control panel, and sent the petite fingertips of her right hand rapidly prance about one smaller collection of brightly lit buttons at one side of the center console of her station. With that, she began gently fondling the silver Bluetooth earpiece with her left fingers at the same time, finally speaking the words,
This is the USS Thor's Hammer, NCC 2103, calling 9th Fleet Command Office for Admiral Bartholomew Harris Mancuso. Please respond.
Admiral Bartholomew Harris Mancuso. A few moments of silent pause later, Lieutenant Ling nodded to herself and then turned slightly in her chair so as to once again face Captain McAllister and Chip.
He's on, sir.
On screen, please.
McAllister replied instantly, his now more blankly stared focus still on the main viewer in anticipation. Again, the familiar single sift ping ran out over the electronic background noise that filled the bridge, and suddenly an older man in far more ornately decorated Starfleet uniform, complete with gold leaf billeted white officer's cap, appeared upon the view screen.
So you got him?
The man inquired without delay. Dowed the moment, he seemed entirely devoid of emotion as he waited for McAllister's response.
Sitting right in front of us.
McAllister blurted with a subtle shake of his head and his tongue still in his cheek to denote his apparent discomfort with the current situation.
And sir, you're not gonna fucking believe what Charvanek just said she was gonna give us.
Yeah, those damn cloak units.
Admiral Mancuso chuckled with a comical grin. Suddenly, McAllister took a deep breath and sighed heavily with his eyes momentarily drifted down and away from the main viewer. But without delay, his eyes darted back up to meet Mancuso's as he again blurted,
More than that, actually. She just told me that once all is said and done, she and her subordinates are gonna hand us the ship themselves to actually keep.
Mancuso frowned in a moment of apparent confusion. Then suddenly, he calmly shot back.
You're shitting me.
McAllister shook his head more briskly and said,
No. Oh, but it gets better.
How so?
Mancuso smirked comically again with a raised eyebrow.
She said that even all that is still secondary to what she's really here to give us, as she puts it.
McAllister explained with a chuckle of his own, coupled with an assertive nod.
Which is?
Mancuso queried once more with an inquisitive tilt of his chin at McAllister.
She didn't say yet, other than that she and her fellows on both ships were here to warn us about what's coming our way and how they will be asking something of the Federation's highest authorities for what they've come to offer us.
McAllister explained yet again, having sarcastically quoted Charvanek's words.
She's yet to explain what that was gonna be either.
Oh, I can tell you right now what that part sounds like it's gonna be.
Mancuso nodded, cleverly smirking in turn.
Sounds to me like she's about to request asylum in the Federation. And that tells me what she and her fellow defectors, let's just go ahead and say it out loud now, are about to hand us over is them trying to buy their way in.
Yes, sir.
McAllister nodded back again.
But you've got to admit, it's a solid buy-in if that's what's going on here.
Yeah, solid as a 2-week-old cow turd down in Texas in my book.
Mancuso fired back jokingly with another smirk.
Assuming, of course, that this isn't one.
Meanwhile, various personnel spread throughout the bridge couldn't help but do everything from chuckle silently to themselves to flash entertained grins and the like in reaction to Admiral Mancuso's less than clean commentary thus far. Lieutenant Ming in particular, while dipping her chin into her chest and letting her eyes drift to the floor before her feet, let out a soft giggle that was heard by all present. Then, raising her head and eyes back to the view screen with a smile struggling its way onto her face, she playfully commented,
That is something only you would say, sir.
And don't you forget it, little lady.
Mancuso grinned back to Ming in turn. His expression then instantly turned more serious, to the point of being slightly stern, as he refocused his attention upon McAllister yet again.
So what now?
Well, presumably they're ripping their cloaks out now and putting them on the transporter pads to send over to us.
McAllister himself replied with a now lessened grin.
She also seemed adamant about coming over here herself along with them. And she made it sound like that might be when she finally gets to this other elephant in the room we haven't gotten to yet. We're waiting for us to call back on that. She said half an hour to unhook the units and get them to the transporters.
Mancuso nodded silently in a moment of apparent contemplation, then tilting his chin at McAllister once more and asking,
So the ships too, huh? They got plasma ring guns on them, don't you know?
Both ships are in mint condition too.
McAllister confirmed with visible enthusiasm.
She said the ships are only one tech gen back from Bodden because that's the best they could get away with stealing and still not get caught. But mint.
Don't matter.
Mancuso shook his head.
That's still recent enough cloaking and gunnery tech to give us a solid look at where the Ramis are at these days. And we're gonna get 2 mint-condition specimens at the hard firepower them bastards are packing?
McAllister said nothing as yet, instead glaring at Mancuso in wait with a slightly anxious look on his face.
You trust her?
Mancuso asked sternly again. With another shake of the head, McAllister shrugged and replied in a hesitant but calm tone.
Can't believe I'm actually saying this, sir, but yes.
McAllister shrugged nonchalantly once more and added,
Hey, you gotta give her this much, sir. In the end, she did make the right decision and saved what was left of the Enterprise. And they only lost 4 crew. LTJ Smith, who turned out to be another Esper, Ship's Counselor McKenna, and those 2 redshirts who that Lana bitch made kill themselves.
Mancuso smirked and nodded again, his eyes drifting off for but a moment as he quickly responded,
True.
His eyes then darted back up to meet McAllister's again, and he added,
I also talked to Jim first thing when the RNZ outpost you're sitting there next to right now initially got that message from her in the first place.
Oh yeah? What did he have to say about this?
McAllister asked with a raised eyebrow of his own.
Believe it or not, he actually said he's still grateful that she did that. So his suggestion is we give her a fair shake at this. Just have a few guards around as a formality is all.
Mancuso shrugged casually.
Roger that, sir.
McAllister nodded in agreement.
We're coming up on just a few minutes till her half hour's up. We'll know soon enough.
McAllister was suddenly cut off in mid-sentence by Lieutenant Ming, who suddenly reached up to gently touch her Bluetooth earpiece with her left hand, all the while staring blankly at her console and announcing,
She's signaling again, sir. I think it's time.
The moment of truth. Mancuso, having heard Ming's announcement and glanced over towards her, his eyes then locked intently back to McAllister's. With that, he nodded confidently and said,
Alrighty, let me know how this goes down.
Aye, aye, sir.
McAllister reassured, with what was now an eager grin.
Oh, one more thing. About Jim Kirk again.
The Admiral quickly interjected.
Sir.
McAllister acknowledged intently.
Jim also said he's gonna want to hear how Char's doing after all these years.
Mancuso grinned sheepishly.
Guess he has high hopes for her too after all that. Honestly, I don't blame him.
Responding with a more confident nod of his own and lingering grin, McAllister replied,
Understood, sir. We'll update you when we got it to report.
With that, McAllister suddenly offered the Admiral a proper military salute of the right hand from where he had been sitting in the captain's chair, which was returned by the Admiral's own salute. Without delay, McAllister impatiently thrust his rigidly extended left arm and forefinger straight out to his side and slightly back in a gesture towards Lieutenant Ming. Instantly, there came another soft ping in the background, and the image on the main viewer switched from Admiral Mancuso to that of Charvanek, who stood squarely facing forward and offering a subtle grin to McAllister and company. Charvanek was now standing in a smaller room next to a small, pedestal-like angled console of a conservative size, the lower lateral edge of which was suspended at about waist height on the average adult man. Several meters straight back behind her, and deeply recessed into the far wall of the room, there was an open-faced cubicle cavity that looked large enough to be occupied by 9 adults. The gunmetal gray metallic floor of the cubicle space was a raised, stage-like platform similar to that of a Starfleet standard transporter. And, just as similarly, the front of that small stage included 2 upward steps from the lower main floor of the rest of the room. And sure enough, standing upright and supported by their respective thin gray metallic wire-frame display stands, there was a pair of waist-high, odd-looking cylindrical metallic modules that matched in appearance. They bristled with various mechanical-looking accoutrements and apparent connecting ports, and were each topped with semi-translucent frosty white glass globes, which were themselves topped with steel thermos-like nodules that simmed straight upward by about 6 inches or so. The matching pair of devices, which were presumably the 2 cloaking devices from both of the Romulan Stormbirds, now stood located on 2 of the innermost neon green glowing hexagonal translucent glass transporter pads that were set into and raised by about half an inch from the surrounding gunmetal gray stage floor. And behind them, the approximately 1 foot wide floor-to-ceiling reed wall panels of the transporter cubicle offered additional soft green glow of their own. Sharvanik, behind whom stood 3 Romulan men in the usual shimmering bronze uniform smocks with black fish-scale patterns and hanging right-shoulder drapes in a subdued blue color, turned half to her right to face partly away and towards the transporter behind her. Glancing at the transporter itself from back over her half-turned shoulder, she grinned yet again and quipped,
As you can see, our only means of avoiding what risk we would likely face in passing through your territory are ready to be turned over to you.
She paused long enough to turn fully forward again and once more squarely face the screen, then continuing,
Along with myself.
Captain McAllister nodded quietly in response to Sharvanik, then turning his head and eyes slightly back over his left shoulder and quickly announcing,
Lieutenant, get Transporter Room 2 ready to receive.
Aye, sir.
Ming nodded as her fingertips rapidly ticked about another set of the glowing green peg-like button columns rising from the slick black angled control panel at which she sat. After a moment's pause spent gazing down at one of the various readouts to the right of the green buttons column, Ming nodded and glanced over to McAllister.
They show green.
Anytime you're ready, Shah. May I call you Shah?
Captain McAllister chirped in an almost playful, mocking tone with another raised eyebrow above a smug grin. Sharvanik grinned fondly back at him and chuckled to herself as her eyes momentarily drifted downward again before returning to McAllister. With that, she grinned a little more and reassured.
We didn't come here as still commissioned Imperial subordinates, Captain.
At that moment, McAllister frowned in confusion, but said nothing and continued to listen instead.
We came here as free defectors. We are never going back.
Sharvanik added her grin suddenly seemed to fade into an almost discernible sadness of some sort. McAllister's smug grin as well faded into what almost looked like a look of half-understanding empathy for Sharvanik and her present company. And at that moment, he spoke in what sounded like an equally empathetic tone.
We'll talk about that after you get over here.
Sharvanik's expression suddenly turned to one of subtle pleading and sternness as she instantly fired back.
First things first, though. There is a far more pressing matter to discuss, and your authorities need to be informed of it now, as soon as I'm on your ship.
But it does sound like my commanding admiral guessed it right.
McAllister began curiously. Sharvanik then offered a slight sideways tilt of her head, coupled with an inquisitive frown of her own, but said nothing.
You're about to request asylum.
McAllister inquired, blankly.
More.
Sharvanik responded, as her facial expression softened back to the previously seen plea with her eyes, this time vaguely showing a sense of urgent need.
We want access to your Federation's legal immigration system. We want full, permanent citizenship.
McAllister's jaw dropped slightly, his eyebrow once again raised. He was also stunned to silence. The blonde female first officer, who had been standing right beside the captain keeping silent, suddenly cocked her head at the view screen, just as a wide-eyed look of disbelief appeared on her face. Lieutenant Ming, meanwhile, who had now spun around in her chair to directly face the view screen, gently bit the side of her lip beneath her dismay-perked eyebrows. Similar expressions of disbelief and general shock could be seen on all others present on the bridge, and for the moment all was silent except for the ever-continuing electronic chatter of the various bridge consoles around them all. But then at once the silence was broken by McAllister, who suddenly blinked himself back to reality and nodded as he softly asserted,
You do understand we'll expect fair value for what you're asking.
Offering a single confirming nod of her own in turn, Sharvanik instantly barked.
And we have it to give, Captain. What we're asking is small compared to the utterly vital quality and nature of the actionable intelligence we're about to offer you.
I hope you don't mind if I be the judge of that.
McAllister nodded cautiously yet again.
Not at all.
Sharvanik blurted with a single shake of her head.
But you will agree once you hear what I tell you, and then give you the parcel of documentation to support it.
Fair enough. I'm headed down now.
McAllister responded with skepticism returning to his voice and an almost sarcastic tilt of the head. With that, he abruptly launched himself out of the captain's chair and marched towards the split, dull gray turbo-lift doors to the rear left quarter of the bridge. As the doors suddenly hissed open when he marched into the turbolift, he clearly enunciated,
Commander Carmichael, you have the con.
Not waiting for a reply from the blonde female first officer who McAllister had just called Commander Carmichael, he spun around where he now stood inside the cylindrical volume of the turbolift and assumed a motionless stance as the split doors suddenly hissed shut. Now bearing a nervous gaze that was still focused on the now closed turbolift doors from back over her half-turned left shoulder, Commander Carmichael weakly muttered to herself in an almost near whisper,
Aye, sir.
She then turned to squarely face the main viewer again, only to see Sharvanik now impatiently marching up onto the gunmetal gray metallic surface of the transporter platform, and finally spin around to face forward, where she now stood on one of the glowing green hexagonal transporter pads closest to the front edge of the platform itself. But just as Carmichael saw Sharvanik open her mouth and heard the merest fraction of a syllable escape her open mouth, Carmichael interrupted with a pleading tone of her own.
Ma'am, I should just let you know now. So far, you really have been very polite about this whole awkward mess you may have just created, so I'll give you points for that. But just a word of advice, you should give our captain a little leeway as far as how he's handling this whole thing.
I did note a certain anxiety in him just now. I first thought it just the general product of our being Romulans, bringing you what I admit probably does look to you like a hard-to-believe golden offer.
Sharvanik seemed to half inquire, with a confused frown and another slight side tilt of her head.
Let me tell you why.
Commander Carmichael instantly countered with an assertive nod and a wave of her extended right forefinger across her midsection in an equally assertive gesture.
His father was Commander Jeffrey McAllister.
Who was...
Sharvanik commented curiously with another confused shake of the head and a still present frown.
The commander of RNZ Outpost Number 5.
Commander Carmichael nodded sternly, then emitting a seemingly frustrated sigh from deep within her chest. Upon hearing this, Sharvanik's eyes shot wide open, as if she were a deer in approaching headlights. Her jaw simultaneously dropped wide open with apparent horror. Just then, her how-quivering right hand shakingly raised up in front of her and flattened itself upon her chest. Stunned to what looked like a mortified silence, her hand then closed into a tightly balled fist such that she now had an almost ripping grasp at the fabric of her mid-thigh skirted Romulan uniform dress.
No!
She whispered shakily as tears began to just well in her still widened eyes, her lower lip quivering just slightly.
Yeah, and FYI, by the way.
Commander Carmichael began with a new urgency in her voice to match her perked eyebrows, as well as the seemingly aggravated nod of her head, then explaining further in what was rapidly becoming an angrier tone.
Our Cap was only 4 friggin' years old during that, just so you know. Never mind that his dad was also a valuable asset to Starfleet. The man lost his fucking father before he was even old enough to understand what that really meant, okay?
Sharvanik, once more stunned to a mortified silence, slowly unclenched the chest of her uniform and raised her even more intently shaken right hand upward to gently cover her mouth in utter remorse. At the same time, the tears in her eyes became small pools until finally a single tear trickled down her cheek.
And just so we're clear,
Commander Carmichael barked angrily again, suddenly launching a rigidly extended right forefinger at the main viewer.
it was one of your Praetor's fucking birds that did it.
Commander Carmichael was now scowling ever more angrily at Sharvanik for a moment, before explaining once more while gesturing aggressively about her own person with her hands.
And just in case you need an explanation as to why the hell I'm taking it so personally, it is not just because I'm loyal to my captain.
As Jarvanik stood there, still frowned with horror at this new and heartbreaking revelation, her lip quivered once again. But still, she said nothing as she listened to Commander Carmichael nearly whimper the next soul-crushing words. And indeed, while taking a single step backward from where she had continued to stand next to the now empty captain's chair, Carmichael herself did struggle to get those next terrible words out of her mouth, as a few tears finally slid down her cheek to match those of Charvanik's.
It's because I lost a husband at Outpost Number 4. There are times where I can still see the effect of him never getting a chance to know his father, plus how hard it hit him to be told one day as a kid exactly why that is. And he wouldn't be the only one, not by far.
Charvanik couldn't help but tilt her head to the side again, now pouting from beneath the tears that had left glistening downward streaks that descended past the corners of her lips. Her eyebrows were now perked with sadness to match. But finally, she took a deep and shaken breath and spoke with a soft-spoken, almost apologetic tone.
Look, that man out there is no longer any praetor of mine. It was never the Star Empire's banner I was so loyal to. It was my beloved Romulan people that he was already just beginning to crush under his boot. I just didn't know, and I wouldn't come to know for years yet to come, just how bad he was about to get. You should know that when he sent that ship to start blasting away at your outposts just to test what at the time was the Star Empire's newest weapon, I openly opposed his decision to send it out. The only reason he didn't have me executed for that, it turns out, was because I was his most experienced bird of prey commander. See, I headed up the research and development program for the Improved Cloaking Device project. But I swear to you that I had absolutely no idea whatsoever that he had a second program in work to develop the plasma ring weapon. I didn't even know that the cursed thing was an idea until the prototype bird of prey put to space for trial runs. I just knew about the cloaking device and the new disruptor beam turrets. Then I saw it fire off the ring for the first time and turn one whole side of an asteroid, almost half the size of Earth's moon, into one bone-chilling landscape of what you would call black obsidian lava glass. That rock will be deadly radioactive for the next 30,000 of your homeworld's years after being hit with the plasma ring in that test. A test I didn't even know was going to be part of the ship's demonstration on the day in question, for a weapon I didn't know had been developed until the moment I saw it fired on that asteroid. And by the way, during the Enterprise's final outing that I was on board for, the bird of prey I had shown up in did not hit the Enterprise at even a fraction of its full power. When the subcommander fired at the USS Congo and then at the Enterprise, he fired it at, well, believe it or not, that was the minimal power for the weapon. And he only did that so he could fire multiple shots in the space of a few minutes without having to wait several for it to recharge again. The first one at the Congo, then the Enterprise. If he had hit us with the weapon at full power, the Enterprise and everything on it would have been literal space dust, no matter how much power Mr. Scott would have dumped into the shields from the warp drive. But let me assure you that when I finally did see that weapon fired for the first time on that day of its initial demonstration, it took all my strength not to literally vomit all over my uniform boots the second I saw it. I had to pretend I needed to use the facilities just so I could get away to a woman's restroom and finally throw up in the toilet. And I barely made it in time to keep from throwing up all over the hallway floor. And then, when I came back to rejoin the rest of the Tal Shiar senior commanders who attended the demonstration, I heard the Praetor give the order to send that very ship to your border, that very day, with what was supposed to be the new permanent commander on board. But later, when I heard that your USS Enterprise had supposedly blasted it out of the sky, I secretly felt happy to hear that news. I found myself hoping the Praetor had come to his senses and decommissioned the use of the plasma ring weapon after that, but it didn't happen.
All the while that Commander Carmichael had been listening to Charvanik's heart-wrenching tale to match her own, Carmichael simply stood there frowning and scowling away at Charvanik herself. But for the moment, she could say nothing as she listened to Charvanik explain further. And indeed, Charvanik did continue.
What's worse is that I couldn't do anything about it. I was just one Imperial officer, so I elected to at least try to appear to be a loyal one for the psychotic old fool in a golden silk shoulder sash, so he wouldn't kill me before I could possibly find an opportunity, if ever, to at the very least leave the Star Empire with what I could steal to give to you. But of course, things working the way they do there, I could never go back then. I considered it what your culture calls a godsend that the Enterprise was later sent on a top-secret mission to steal a cloak from one of our first-generation battlecruisers, if possible. But I already had intel that your Joint Chiefs were planning that mission. I just didn't tell anyone, because I actually wanted Kirk to succeed. But I had to play it like I was loyal to the Star Empire so that when I let them get away with the stolen cloak, it wouldn't look like I did that on purpose. I just didn't expect the Enterprise's chief engineer to figure out how to hook one of your cloaks to their ship and actually make it work. But seeing him miraculously make that work made me happy inside too, just so you are aware.
Pausing for a moment to offer Carmichael a scowl of her own, Charvinik finally added,
That, by the way, was beyond my wildest dreams, and it just so happens that I quietly celebrated Kirk's mission success in my own mind. But even letting myself be taken prisoner wasn't good enough for me when it came to a chance to be free of the Praetor. I wanted to one day figure out how to get a plasma ring weapon to you as well. So when they next released me back to the Romulan Imperial custody, which was yet another unexpected godsend to me, the first thought in my mind was to get myself reintegrated back into the Imperial ranks so I could someday find a way to pull this off. But I knew I couldn't do it alone, and the odds were that it would be a very long time before I could even begin to try and plan anything like this. It was still another stroke of what I believe you would call sheer dumb luck that your Commander Spock simply messaged me one day that the Enterprise was yet again headed straight for Romulan space for a second time. And that was only for me to discover that those blasted espers were trying to make it to the Great Barrier after stealing the starship Congo. But when I got his message, I couldn't steer my new bird of prey toward the Enterprise fast enough. I was hoping to eventually ask Kirk and Spock for some kind of help in what would eventually be my secret efforts to dig into something else I'd recently heard about. You see, not long before I had started hearing vague, but let me assure you, extremely bone-chilling rumors, that even before the first bird of prey, or the first cloaking device, or even what would become its primary weapon was on the drawing board, the Praetor had already long since begun another far more horrific military science program of, well, believe it or not, a far, far darker kind. But it was supposedly something that would still be years of work before it would ever be put to use. Until now. And after what happened at the end of the encounter with the Espers and the Congo, I knew that I had nothing solid to show your Captain Kirk as yet. I wasn't even sure what to tell him at that point, so as much as I hated it, I had to keep my mouth shut and keep my bird of prey back to my home stars so I could find a way to dig further into what I was starting to hear about. And now I have at least some of the actual files that document the secret work in question, and what I saw in the files I was able to fully download in the time I had. It made me throw up all over again. And now the utter nightmare those files speak of, it's on its way to your borders as we speak. And thanks to the talented engineering geniuses among my fellow defectors, we were only just barely able to push our quantum singularity drives to very dangerous levels just to get here before the new threat reaches any of your Starfleet assets.
At that moment, Commander Carmichael abruptly wiped her tears from her still flustered cheeks and gave but a single sniffle. Then, with a catch in her throat, she more calmly asked,
And is that what you're finally here to warn us about?
Charvanik slowly squeezed her still wetted eyes shut, took a deep breath, and almost forcefully huffed.
Yes!
Her eyes then popped open, in turn fixing themselves into an almost icy glare straight at Commander Carmichael. And again she began to explain with cold intensity.
Look, I'm sorry it took me and others who couldn't serve him anymore this long to find a way. And I am so sorry that we couldn't stop the annihilation of all of those Federation outposts back in the 2260s. I'm also more sorry that you and your captains and so many other loved ones died in that absolute effrontery to common decency and civilized behavior. But even deciding to take this chance now was not a perfectly executed one. After what I just acquired confirmed knowledge of, I had no choice but to risk everything coming here, this way, now. It was a last resort to do it this haphazardly, but the timing gave us no choice. And when I say risk everything, I don't just mean the inherent risks to myself, although I did face great personal risks of my own just to pull this off, and all the other Romulan defectors who came with me on these two Stormbirds risked no less. No, I mean risk to the entire Romulan people, not just to yours. If word that I'm here with these ships, and more importantly, the information I bring you, gets out before it can get to your government, some very terrible things will start happening inside your territory far ahead of the Praetor's original schedule. And we already have mere days at best before it all starts. Days, madam.
Now seemingly more calm, but still showing sadness through her lingering stare towards the image on the main view screen of Charvanik on her transporter pad, Commander Carmichael sighed and half moaned.
So, what is this new weapon? Or whatever it is?
Actually, this one is a who, not a what.
Charvanik nodded again, with a returning pleading expression. And with that, she glanced down and over to one of the Romulan soldiers among the three who had taken position at the transporter control podium and softly begged,
Centurion, activate now, please.
Commander Carmichael quickly spun around to her rear left quarter so as to address Lieutenant Ming and nod to her assertively. Ming quickly nodded back, then turning back towards her control panel and announced,
Transporter room, she's coming over now. Energize.
You are listening to Severed Ties and Unbroken Chains on STSP. You're listening to Broken Chains and Unsevered Ties on STSP.
From Federation News headquarters in San Francisco, I'm Melinda Mundell-Dorfenstein with this breaking news. A Florida man woke up on Christmas Eve to find a burglar nibbling on his toes, according to the Panama City, Florida Police Office. The suspect has been identified as Earth Star Fleet Commander Charles Trip Tucker III. When the victim asked Commander Tucker what he was doing in his house, the commander said he, quote, was there to eat feet and fix warp engines, and I'm all out of warp engines, unquote.
I don't know, man. I just woke up and my little piggies were all moist, and there he was. The engineer on the fleet's first Warp 5 engine, just nibbling away at my foot fingers.
A fight broke out, and during the struggle the suspect tried to grab the victim's genitals and claimed to have a gun, the report says. Deputies said no weapon was found at the scene. The victim eventually forced Commander Tucker out of the house, but not before the suspect smashed one of the home's windows as well as the windshield of the victim's shuttle pod. Investigators tried to track the suspect with a police tag, but the alleged toe-sucking bandit escaped. We'll keep you updated on any further developments.
It's Crazy Neelix Spaceship City! Come on down to the shipyards at SETI Alpha 3 and see what's on the lot. Looking for an old Akira class to cruise around in style? We've got one! How about something a little more sporty? Here's a freshly rebuilt Defiant class, gently used. It even comes with an illegal Romulan cloaking device. Want something a bit more family-friendly? We've got this beat-up old Corellian freighter here that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs. Plenty of life left in her. Want something that will really turn heads? How about this Freedom Class beauty with one nacelle? Zero down! Come in today and get a free pine-scented bridge freshener with any purchase. Prices and participation may vary. Zero down applies to well-qualified captains with approved Federation credit only. All ships sold as is. Crazy Neelix is not responsible for warp core breaches, annoying Q appearances, or tears in the time-space continuum. We'll see you at Crazy Neelix's Spaceship City. Our prices can't be beat. Woo!
If you like Star Trek shitposting, you're gonna love Stargate shitposting. It's got all the feel of Star Trek shitposting, without all those pesky notifications about new content. Join over 3,400 mostly real people as you talk about shows that aired decades ago. If you love videos of different ships having space battles in space, that's there. Along with lots of bots trying to join and sell t-shirts. But our awesome Modman team bans them on sight. Go away, stupid merch bots. Make the same jokes over and over again. Did you know they sell Jaffa cakes in the UK? That's what the alien guys with the forehead stickers say. C4! 2 L's. Jason Momoa. Make fun of other fans that liked Stargate Universe, even though it was a far superior show with a coherent plot and new ideas. Once we get a new Stargate show, you're going to wish you were here. But we'll probably still be here, just waiting for a new show, or movie, or something. Please? So come on over to Stargate Shitposting, where the shit you'll be posting is about Stargate.
Chapter 2. Foreshadowing the Coming Horror. The nightmare that was to come. Meanwhile, during the later 2/3 or so of the time that Charvanek and Commander Carmichael had been arguing over the past, Captain McAllister had already been in the transporter room, watching the conversation remotely without Charvanek's knowledge. But having heard all Charvanek had explained within the time McAllister had been in the transporter room to witness on the control pedestal's small display screen, stood there staring down at the little LCD screen, not knowing what to say to these revelations. The look on his face was that of a seemingly disillusioned scowl, and it was an expression that was similarly worn on the faces of the young woman transporter technician next to whom he stood, as well as the pair of large, strong-looking security men who stood behind them in wait for Charvanek to begin materializing on any one of the transporter pads. Then suddenly, as they now saw and heard Charvanek speak her last words of conversation with Carmichael, which were followed by the sound of Lieutenant Ming's voice over the intercom saying,
Transporter room, she's coming over now. Energize.
Captain McAllister nodded once to the transporter technician and softly murmured,
Okay, go.
And just as the familiar fading chirp sounded from the control panel before him and the others, so began the gradually louder, deep hum emitting from the transport chamber. A few seconds later, so too did the ringing whine begin and slowly intensify in tandem with the ever-brightening blue transporter beams that had just started to appear in their chamber. Finally, after a moment or two of this, there stood Charvanek on one of the forwardmost transporter pads, with the two removed cloaking devices held in their display stands on their respective pair of rearmost pads. The low, deep hum of the transporter itself was now quickly subsiding back to its subtle background level. Captain McAllister almost hesitantly stepped out from behind the heavy metallic framed glass shielding booth that enclosed the control pedestal and the other uniformed personnel. He then took a few slow steps towards the transport chamber, his further intensified disillusioned scowl aimed squarely at Charvanek herself. Just then, as he came to a halt mere steps from the transport chamber in which she stood, he let his eyes drift down in a moment of troubled thought. Noticing this and reacting with an expression that seemed to convey the inner pain she felt for him, she stood there eyeing him hesitantly in a moment of silent pause. But then, as she opened her mouth to speak, she was instantly cut off before the first syllable of whatever she was about to say could escape her.
I got a confession to make first off.
McAllister murmured with a subtle nod while still staring down and off into space.
It took me maybe a minute or so to get down here from the bridge, so I had my transporter tech relay that convo you and my XO just had down here so I could watch up until you would have finally beamed over. So I saw what I'm guessing is a little over the last half of that convo.
Finally, with his head still hung slightly into his chest, his eyes darted up to meet hers. With a shake of her head, Charvanek just as softly responded,
I'm not even slightly annoyed by that at all. I'm actually happy to know that you heard what I said. At least some of it anyway.
McAllister now raised his head to her, but still said nothing for the moment. Meanwhile, the other personnel behind him, who still remained behind the transparent transporter shielding booth, watched exchange nervously but silently. It was as though they too could feel the pain being rehashed at that moment. Yet Charvanek had more to say, while still not yet having stepped down from within the transport chamber in which she stood.
If only you knew how hard it was for me too, knowing that for literally over 20 years, yes, even before I would ever meet Captain Kirk for the first time, mind you, I desperately wanted to see any possible end to what even back then was already the Praetor's initial tyrannies. And that was long before I would see how much darker and more terrible his ambitions would become, let alone what bizarrely inane machinations he would commission into existence in support of his agenda. Even harder that it would be so many years before I would ever do anything other than feign an unquestioning loyalty to his ideology, his savage policies. Even before I would ever make a move like this, only to be unable to stop what happened along the RNZ so many years ago. I'm sorry for that.
Charvanek let her eyes drift down in clear remorse, then letting a heavy sigh escape her chest as she shook her head and added,
I was so sickened by that. Literally, sickened.
She then raised her head and eyes to McAllister again and further pleaded,
Can it just be enough that I'm here now? To honor your father's memory and that of so many of your other fallen servicemen and women by seeing to the business at hand as soon as possible?
After a moment's pause, Captain McAllister nodded and replied,
Then, let's get down to brass tacks, shall we?
Charvanek flashed him a false grin and finally stepped down from the elevated transport chamber platform, then coming to a halt a mere foot in front of McAllister so as to stand face to face with him. With her chin held high and her eyes locked to his, she more confidently announced,
I hereby present to you these 2 mint condition cloaking units, and the 2 proprietary V-11 Stormbirds from which they came, both in equally pristine condition.
She paused to reach her right hand into a small black leather belt pouch that clung securely to the area of her waist belt that crossed her right hip. From it, she drew a pair of small, domino-like objects, each of whose semi-translucent mass seemed to encompass some manner of light-colored circuitry within them. At one end of each of the two objects, there was a small rectangular metallic label with minuscule text written upon it in English. One such object was a vibrant green in color, and the other was an aquamarine. As she raised the two objects to McAllister's chest only to show him that they were securely pinched between her petite fingers and thumbs, she gazed into his eyes warmly. With that, her eyebrows perked enthusiastically and chirped,
I believe you call these isolinear slides, and as I understand it, they are one of the standard devices you use to store data.
That's correct.
McAllister nodded again, still glaring at her half blankly and half scoldingly.
Good.
Charvanek nodded again, then adding,
The blue slide contains every technical manual, every training manual, and every other piece of documentation your personnel will need in order to learn how to maintain, repair, and operate everything on those Stormbirds sitting just off your bow, including not just those cloaks, but the plasma ring weapons those vessels are equipped with. You are now free to send a skeleton crew over there to take control of those ships and pilot them to your Jupiter research station orbiting Jupiter's moon. My men and women over there will obey any orders that you give toward that end.
McAllister's eyes now glanced down towards the isolinear slides in her hand, all the while his lip contorted as if he were in a moment of cautious thought. Still eyeing the slides before him, he blankly asked,
And the green one?
Charvanek's eyes instantly squeezed shut as she took a deep breath, held it in for a moment, then finally huffed a deep sigh to convey her apparent deeply felt desperation. Her eyes popped open, but were still down as she replied,
That is what I believe you would call the elephant in the room.
You told my wife it's actually a who, not a what?
McAllister quoted inquisitively as his eyes locked assertively to Charvanek, almost as if he were now beginning to interrogate her with a mere look.
What did you mean?
Precisely that.
Charvanek blurted back impatiently, locking her eyes upward to his in turn, and then explaining further.
First things first. We had to take a very big change at the last minute by infiltrating the Romulan Senate's digital archive building, because only from physically inside a particular section could one access the Praetor's most secret project files. Once inside, a few of my men and I had only so much time to download what files we could on this by the time we had before the blackout we initiated on the internal surveillance systems of the building would be discovered. So I didn't get everything on it, just what I could up to the moment we had to get out of there with any chance of not being detected. It's not everything, but it is a great deal of what there is to be had.
Suddenly tilting his chin to her, McAllister grinned faintly and commented,
We humans shave a saying too. Every little bit helps.
And I assure you, this will.
Charvanek insisted in return, giving a single shake of her right hand with the isolinear slide still held in her finger.
Just knowing this girl is headed your way as we speak is better than not.
McAllister frowned inquisitively, cocking his head slightly to one side and saying,
So it's a girl? A young one? A grown woman? What?
I think she's about my age, and she was originally a pure-blooded Romulan like me. But now...
Suddenly, Charvanek was cut off in mid-sentence by McAllister.
Originally? What the hell does that mean exactly? And you said this was a military project, so, has she been re-engineered in some way?
McAllister now eyed Charvanek with an expression of returning hesitation and anxiety. Charvanek's own expression turned to one of desperate pleading, having felt her blood run cold just from broaching the subject that was gnawing at her soul. With that, she more aggressively barked,
You literally don't know the half of it. She's going to be a nightmare for you and your people to deal with.
Suddenly tossing her right hand off to the side with the slide still in her hand, she frowned all the more aggressively and once again barked.
Even all those cursed espers, and I mean all of them combined after having entered the outer galactic barrier, could never so much as dream of matching her if they tried to take her on. You may have to adopt a policy of nuking entire planetary hemispheres just to have a half-decent chance of putting her down after the little bit I skimmed of what's on this slide.
Both McAllister and all three of the uniformed personnel further back behind him now shared similar expressions of shock upon hearing Charvanek's assertions. But McAllister himself, having dropped his jaw for a moment, then pulled himself together and nervously asked,
What can she do?
Suddenly giving another almost demanding nod, Charvanek once more blurted,
"We need to be on our way back to Starfleet headquarters with the green slide in my hand as fast as your engines can get us there without blowing us to your hell."
Now giving a shrug, Captain McAllister quickly responded,
Well, these two PDTs can't leave this area. This is our officially assigned patrol run, right? But we can beam you over to the outpost just across the way, and then they can put you on one of the starships they have docked inside there. One of them actually is headed back to Sol Sector tomorrow, I reckon.
Then that needs to happen now.
Charvanek more quietly demanded with a single nod.
But first, let me say goodbye for now to my men and women who risked everything, right along with me, to abandon their homes along with their families to come here hoping to find a new one. A better one, we hope.
You mind if I review what's on those before we call the outpost?
McAllister asked cautiously.
Just in case. I want to see what's on those, to be sure it's all legit on your end.
Without wasting a moment, Charvanek aggressively grabbed McAllister's right forearm with her left hand and raised it between the two of them at his elbow. Next, she briskly slapped the two isolinear slides into the palm of his hand. At that moment, she yet again barked.
I'll even submit to a Vulcan mind meld to establish the truth of what I've been telling you.
At that moment, she finally released her firm, almost stifling grip on Captain McAllister's forearm and dropped both of her hands back to her sides. Paused in a frowning glare of utter dismay, Captain McAllister finally commented,
You're really not kidding, are you?
With her words yet again slightly quivering in apparent fright, Charvanek could not help but whisper forcibly back,
No, I'm not. And neither will she be.
But then, with her demeanor suddenly growing all the more cold and demanding, Charvanek once again barked.
Now you do whatever it takes to get me, my people, and all we've just given you as far into the middle of protected Federation space as possible, as soon as possible. Everything, literally everything, now depends on it.
A disturbing look at what soon comes. The senior command officers of both the USS Thor's Hammer and the USS Ares were now gathered in the aft-looking Deck 2 observation and conference lounge, the officers of the latter having beamed over to the Thor's Hammer to meet Charvanek in the flesh, and to all review some of the secret information she had seemed so frightened and sickened by. The centralmost four-seated couch that stood next to the descending white star case was occupied at the far end from the stairs by Captain McAllister of the Thor's Hammer herself, Commander Carmichael, who sat next to him, Charvanek, who sat one seat from the staircase end, and Captain Charles Harrigan of the Ares, who sat at the end itself. The surrounding single seats were occupied by various others of varying ranks, both male and female. At the starboard wall of the room was a large flat screen set into the surface, and on that screen, various pages of digital media were being displayed and their contents discussed and analyzed by all present. And as the discussion continued with the progression through the pages and files of data, so did the various states of tension and shock build within the gathering group. At this particular moment, they had already viewed a plethora of still JPEG files of a woman lying on a very high-tech looking surgical table, whose face had been purposely blurred in the image so as to conceal her identity. All that could be vaguely ascertained through the blurred area that covered her face and hair, where it laid skewed above the rough shape of her head, was that her hair was a dark color, perhaps brunette or black. Meanwhile, the table the mysterious young woman, who was presumed to be as Romulan as the small army of fully hazmat-suited lab technicians who could be seen operating on her from all sides, was itself surrounded by a multitude of small metallic wheeled tray tables upon which sat everything from high-tech handheld surgical instruments to strange cylindrical storage containers, similar in appearance to 20th century Earth thermoses and the like, to clear glass vials of both transparent and opaque fluids of equally varied colors to a number of miscellaneous handheld scanning and readout devices. Looking at these images, while leaving all in the room bearing various looks of frowned shock and discomfort on their faces, forced Captain Harrigan to whisper to himself,
She couldn't have volunteered for this. Wonder who she is.
All the while, he was currently holding a large Cuban cigar between the thumb and the pressed together fore and middle fingers of his right hand, where it stood raised by a cocked elbow. His voice, soft-spoken and sounding slightly weathered, still managed to reveal a mild concern for the welfare of the mystery woman.
I'm sorry, Captain.
Charvanek moaned with regret in her voice as she turned her head slightly to her left, with her eyes glancing at Harrigan through their left corners.
If there were any clues to her identity, they must surely have been in the remaining files I didn't have time to download onto the isolinear slide before I and my spies had to get out of the building before getting caught.
After a moment's pause, If having ignored Charvanik for a second or two, he finally twitched his head back to his right in a fleeting glance towards her, before instantly returning his troubled scowl towards a screen and further commenting.
And we haven't even gotten to the actual documents yet.
The others in the room, seemingly oblivious to his commentary, remained gripped by the disturbing images of medical depravity on the screen before them. That is, until Harrigan leaned slightly forward in his seat and asked,
Yeoman, can you get us into those, if you please?
With that, Captain Harrigan gently thrust the cigar between his lips and inhaled lightly, then maneuvering it back to its previous position of being held close to the area of his collarbone. And, standing to the right of the screen, was a uniformed female crew member whose auburn cinnamon hair had been done up in a conservative bun. Her uniform included the lower mid-thigh black military skirt, with a single 1-inch wide white stripe descending down each of its sides. In her left hand was a flat metallic tablet-like device that was about half an inch thick and roughly 7 inches by 4 in surface area. Upon hearing Harrigan's request, she raised her right hand to the black glassy control surface of the tablet. Sending her fingertips sprinkling about the varied blue-toned square button icons spread about its touchscreen surface with the soft but rapid clicking sound of her fingernails tapping away at it, she opened and relayed still more new files to the larger view screen set into the wall next to which she stood. All the while, with her head slightly lowered over the tablet she held, her eyes would dart back and forth between it and what new pages of data began to show up on the large view screen for all to see. As the first pages of apparent genealogical scientific data began to appear and fill the screen as neatly arranged leaflets as if they were an old-style PDF file, her eyes turned all the more trouble at she saw. But her expression was similarly matched by all others in the room, all except Charvanik, who instead appeared offended to the point of disgust.
My God,
Harrigan murmured to himself again, amidst the various softly heard sighs and gasps emitted by the others around him. Commander Carmichael, looking mildly horrified through her slight pout, nearly whined her analytical summary to herself aloud for others to hear.
So they, what? Strap her to a table? Put her under? And mix the genomes of all these different species into her basic genetic code? I'm seeing these references to their apparently having mixed her with protein codes from an earth tapeworm, a hummingbird. Looks like they did that just to give her the ability to consciously regenerate any major injuries that would likely kill any of us. And also to consciously speed up or slow down her core metabolism in support of that ability. I see. When you cut a tapeworm in half, it grows 2 new separate tapeworms. And when a hummingbird goes to sleep for the night, it consciously sows its metabolism into a near hibernating slow pace. Yeoman, scroll to the next group of pages, please.
With that, the female yeoman slid the rip of her right forefinger upward along the rightward edge of the tablet's slick control surface, and the several grid-arranged pages of documents moved upward to reveal the next until coming to another stop there. After a few seconds of silence, shared by all present, there came the soft-spoken voice of another man sitting in one of the nearby single seats, an especially fit-looking uniformed man in his late 20s, of olive-skinned Afro-American descent, whose firm black hair had been neatly shaved into a military crew cut, and whose white right shoulder rank display strap bore the rank of lieutenant commander.
Also, looks like they added a genome I know I don't recognize. I've never seen this one in my years, both in Starfleet Medical School or in the time I've been assigned to this ship. But it looks like this extra genome. Looks like they put that in mostly just her nervous system. Spinal cord, nerve clusters throughout her body, and especially her brain psionic region. So whatever the extra species genome is, that tells me either they did it to give her extra mental powers, or pump up whatever one she likely already had. Note also, sir.
Briefly pausing, the young man, who was apparently the ship's surgeon, gestured towards the screen with his right hand as he continued.
These recorded measurement results from when they tested the new electrochemical activity all in her brain and her body's neuropsionic areas. According to this, they started trying to invent a whole new Esper scale in an attempt to come up with a close projection of what her new levels of psionic ability would be, but it also looks like they fell just short of being able to come up with a measurement system that'd give 'em an idea what that was going to be. Looks to me like even they didn't expect what they were doing to pump up near that much. So if they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams.
But suddenly, the young ship surgeon was cut off mid-sentence by Captain Harrigan again, who spoke with subtle sternness that was offset by an almost eerie calm.
Or beyond their darkest nightmares, Mr. Bates.
And with that, Harrington tooged another puff of his cigar before continuing.
You see, Mr. Bates, this will not be the first time an ambitious scientific endeavor has strived to weaponize man himself, regardless what species from which that man hailed.
Pausing to tilt his chin slightly up while letting his eyes star off into space, as if in a moment of deep contemplation, he continued still further with a certain air of intellectuality about him.
I'm reminded of a piece of case study material written by then-Captain James Tiberius Kirk, in which he described his encounter with an old pre-war Earth freighter by the name of SS Botany Bay. Once on board, he and his select senior officers discovered that this particular freighter had been re-engineered to accommodate above 70 men and women who had been placed in cryo before the ship was sent off into the cold vastness of the interstellar unknown. They had once held all the planet Earth within their iron grasp until the great eugenics war of the mid to late 1990s to remove them from power. A war that ended with the most costly victory and their decidedly permanent expulsion from our world, son. The man who led them was named Khan Noonien Singh. He would later move to take the Enterprise, only to once again be brought to his timely fall and be expelled to planet Ceti Alpha 5. But these men and women, Mr. Bates, men and women who had been genetically engineered with superior physical prowess and mental functionality, they had originally been created with the intention of securing for oneself the ability to topple enemy nations on command, but not in pursuit of their own ambitions, as was the unexpected but perhaps inevitable result.
Funny you should bring that up, sir.
The young black medical officer, who Harrigan had called Mr. Bates, interjected with its focus once more returning to the view screen with a second gesture of hand to match, and thus he continued.
Look, there on the next page, the Romulan scientists somehow recreated that too, looks like. So it looks to me like they're after they added in the unknown extra species genome into neural functions, they did their version of the Khan-style eugenics thing to her after that to pump her up more. So now she's not just way more powerful with her mental abilities, but she's likely way physically stronger too. It says here they figured out how to do that after they got a hold of Doc McCoy's examination records from when he looked Khan over initially.
Upon hearing and reading the information in question for himself from the screen, Harrigan frowned with subtly displayed shock in his returning scowl.
So, the Ramis have spies throughout the Federation, including Starfleet Medical, it seems,
he hissed in annoyance. All the while that the others were having this discussion, Charvanek had been sitting amidst them with her arms crossed over her stomach and an icy stare into the open space in front of her. But she had kept silent all that while until finally she murmured,
I was sickened when I started reading this.
Again, tilting his head slightly back in his characteristically intellectual way, he again commented,
Ha ha! I'm sure you were, little lady, but this discovery also threatens us with the sad prospect of having to re-vet all Vulcans currently in Starfleet or higher Federation governmental employ, a prospect the thought of which I don't relish. You see, miss, in the pre-interstellar history of my homeworld of Earth, there was once a terrible campaign we call World War II. And during that campaign, America felt forced to invoke what it saw as a need to gather all persons of known Japanese descent into what they called concentration camp. The reason for that calamity included that the island nation of Imperial Japan at that time had begun waging a war of conquest against post-World War I China. And more than this, because President Roosevelt had anticipated a future attack upon the United States at some point, an attack that did occur at a place called Pearl Harbor. If we now in the present age have spies in places sufficient as to gain the Romulan military-industrial complex usable access to such recreatable knowledge as the physiological makeup of the eugenic supermen who now thrive on Ceti Alpha 5, then we are faced with the unfortunate debate as to how best to root out these spies without violating the civil liberties of our beloved Federation's Vulcan citizens.
Pausing for a moment to take yet another puff of his cigar, Captain Harrigan shook his head to Charvanek and added,
"And make no mistake, my dear, there is never a perfect answer to that riddle."
We got anything on her psychological profile?
Captain McAllister asked sharply, with a sarcastic headshake and an inquisitive glare aimed squarely at Charvanek.
As I told you before,
Charvanek began timidly.
I couldn't get everything out of that data bank before the security blackout we caused was about to be discovered and seen to. So unfortunately not.
Which means we don't even know if she's had any combat training,
Commander Carmichael interjected with a frustrated expression.
If this was a Tal Shiar military program, which it was,
Charvanek nervously glanced over to Carmichael.
then you should operate on the guaranteed certainty that she is in fact heavily combat trained, probably with almost obsessive focus imposed by her handlers.
So in theory, Miss Char.
Captain Harrigan spoke again in his usual contemplative intellectual tone.
She may well at the very least be trained to a level equivalent to our Mako special operators.
Charvanek glared straight forward into space in front of her, took a deep breath, and huffed a powerful sigh that demonstrated her anxiety. After a moment's pause, she nodded as if in resignation to the hard reality of the looming situation, and finally replied,
At the very least.
As if attempting to maintain a continuing veneer of arrogant sophistication, Harrigan once again took a puff of his cigar and commented,
Simply wonderful, these modern times we live in.
Commander Carmichael suddenly shook her head in apparent annoyance as she again blurted,
Do we at least have any info on exactly what her psionic abilities are supposed to even be?
That, yes.
Charvanek hot back eagerly, quickly gesturing towards the screen with a casual fling of her right hand.
In fact, once I had even gotten into the database, as soon as I entered the room, I made it a point to find that data. As much as I could find at all on her actual powers is on that slide.
Then perhaps we should focus on the remainder of this little discussion on that.
Harrigan interjected again with a nod. Then, giving a subtle, assertive gesture of his cigar-holding right hand towards Charvanek, he jovially added with a clever grin,
Know thine enemy.
Next, he turned to the female yeoman standing next to the wall screen and offered a similar gesture towards her and murmured,
Yeoman?
The female yeoman once again ticked away the touchscreen of her tablet, and again the neatly arranged collection of digital pages on the screen changed. Once more displaying multiple pages of text that included blocks of scientific jargon, the female yeoman quickly slid the tip of her right forefinger upward along the rightward edge of the tablet's touchscreen for a moment or two as if in search of the desired information. Then at once, what Harrington was looking for was quickly spotted by both himself and all others present. On the screen before them, written in frightening detail, were descriptions of immeasurably strong telekinetic ability, matter transmutation capability, and well-honed mild meld skills, the genetically boosted strength behind which the potential to literally mind meld a subject into lethal cerebral hemorrhage and other forms of highly destructive neurological trauma was anticipated. More, and almost outlandishly strong resistance to forced mind melds of any power level thus far tested was apparent in the subject as well. And, according to the documentation there, it was recorded that the subject was observed as having not only been nigh impervious to any attempts at a forced mind meld, but that the subject could apparently forcibly rebound that forced mind meld attempt back on the meld's initiator with equally lethal results. These facts thus far alone had now already sent all in the room huffing and sighing deeply, in everything from subtly displayed horror to general shock. But as the yeoman continued to slowly scroll the pages ever upward for the others to examine on, they were quickly seen additional descriptions of a sort of highly effective psionic proximity sensation, the observed and documented performance characteristics of which seemed to act like sort of a psychic radar by which the subject could sense the approach of biological entities, any energy fields of an electromagnetic measurable nature, and any solid objects whose comprising materials would be similarly registered by electromagnetic detection. Further, it was seen in still oncoming pages that the subject's bone structure was now made especially strong due to the eugenics engineering that had been done to her. Continued segments of information in that vein began to reveal to everyone in the room that the subject was made to test this, and in fact all her physical enhancements, by performing such tasks as successfully punching through half-inch thick hard sheet steel at one point without injury to her hands, punching fist dents in 18-gauge duranium sheet metal, and so on. Other documented physical endurance testing results, now being revealed as the whole room continued to read them, included a high resistance to such energy exposures as high-voltage artificial lightning arcs, disruptor and phaser blasts up to the highest stun setting, and a near total impervium to handheld Klingon agonizers and a strong resistance to the effect of agonizer booths. Everyone in the room except Charvanek now gazed at the information on the screen with similar wide-eyed looks of horror and anxiety. As well, they were all shocked to absolute silence. The suffocating silence shared by all ended up lasting several seconds. Charvanek herself, however, simply sat there with a cold, icy glare into space, as if she was feeling not only disgusted, but ashamed.
And this bitch from hell is headed towards the Federation as we speak,
Barked Captain McAllister in
Mortified
disbelief.